That's just how things are now, honey. 16-year-old Amos Rowe heard his mother get that answer at the feed store, and something in him went quiet for good. 6 years. 6 years of trucks dumping crushed cane on 80 acres his family had held since 1901. The refinery knew exactly what it was doing. The Rowes couldn't afford a lawyer, and the deed was split among 11 relatives across 3 states. Then, in September, Amos found a tomato plant growing in the middle of that dump. Waist high, loaded with fruit, in ground where nothing had grown for years. He crouched down, put 2 fingers in the dirt, and how are you alive? If you have ever felt like the world stopped listening to quiet people, to farmers, to families without money behind their name, stay with this story. Subscribe if you still believe patience and intelligence count for something. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and what the land meant to the people who raised you. The Rowe place sat on the soft, rolling edge of a river valley in a Louisiana parish where cane had been the pride of 3 generations and the ruin of about that many. 80 acres, a red barn that leaned slightly east, and had leaned that way so long nobody in the family thought of it as leaning anymore. A farmhouse painted the kind of white that had stopped being white sometime in the 1990s and had since settled into a patient gray that no one had the money to argue with. The deed lived in a tin box on the top shelf of the hall closet, and the oldest paper in it was dated 1901. Amos had been shown that paper exactly once when he was 11, and his grandfather had held it by the edges the way a man holds something that might come apart in his hands. Isaiah Rowe did not explain what it had cost a black family to buy 80 acres in that parish in that year, or how unlikely it was that the paper existed at all. He held it up to the kitchen light long enough for the boy to see the ink, and then he put it back in the box. Papa Isaiah had worked that ground for 41 years before his knees quit on him, and even at 79, he still walked part of the fence line most mornings out of habit. He was the one who had taught Amos the phrase, the good bottom, which was what the family called the low corner where the soil ran black and heavy. Isaiah used to say the bottom was so rich, you could push a fence post in with your bare hand and come back on Sunday to find a sprout already climbing it. He said it like a joke. He did not entirely mean it as one. The trouble came the autumn Amos turned 10. A man arrived one afternoon in a tucked-in shirt with a clipboard and a rental car, and he stood in the yard and explained that the back 40 of the Rowe property happened to sit downwind, downhill, and conveniently adjacent to acreage the Callaway Sugar Refining Company had recently purchased. He used the word byproduct a great deal. He used the word temporary even more. What he was asking for, underneath all of it, was permission to stage material on the far side of the old interior fence, the one that split the working ground from the back 40, and he presented it as a small favor between neighbors. Verna Rowe listened with her arms folded and her chin down, and after he drove off, she stood in the yard for a while looking at the place where his car had been. Temporary meant 1 season. Then it meant a year. Then it meant until the new processing facility comes online. A phrase Amos learned could mean anything between 6 months and forever. The trucks came twice a week, then daily. The piles grew until they blocked the view of the tree line. The drainage shifted because that is what water does when you put a mountain in its way, and the good bottom that had once grown sweet corn waist high by July began putting up thin yellow stalks that snapped in the first wind that touched them. The well water took on a faint sourness that Verna refused to comment on, even when asked directly, even when asked twice. His mother did the paperwork because his mother did all the paperwork. She drove to the parish seat and sat in an office with wood paneling and a window unit, and a lawyer told her what she already half knew. The land was heirs' property. Isaiah's father had died without a will, and so had his sister, and the 80 acres now legally belonged to 11 different Rowes scattered across 3 states, some of whom Verna had never met, and 2 of whom had not returned a phone call since the funeral. To sue the refinery, she would need every one of those 11 signatures. She would also need something in the neighborhood of $40,000 up front for soil testing and expert testimony, and the 2 or 3 years the company's attorneys would spend making the case expensive. He was not unkind about it. He wrote the number on a legal pad, turned it around so she could see it, and let her look at it. She tried the other door. Twice, she filled out an application for a farm improvement loan, the kind meant for exactly the sort of soil restoration the bottom needed, and twice the answer came back on a single sheet of paper. The first letter said the application had been declined. The second letter said the same thing in slightly different words. Neither one gave a reason, and neither one needed to. Verna put both letters in the tin box with the deed, which told Amos everything about how she understood the situation. 3 times she drove out to the refinery offices herself. The first time she came home angry, slamming the truck door hard enough that Amos heard it from the barn. The second time she came home quiet and started supper without taking off her coat. The third time she did not talk about it at all, and after that she stopped going. The manager out there was a man named Hal Brennan, and the worst thing about Hal Brennan was that he was not cruel. He was tired in the way men get tired when they have learned that nothing they say will ever be questioned. He poured coffee. He asked after the family. He spoke about regulatory timelines and operational realities and the unfortunate complexities of agricultural runoff, and then he walked Verna to the door and forgot her before the door had finished closing. Papa Isaiah had his own way of measuring the thing. He had worked a season at the old mill as a young man, and he told Amos once, sitting on the tailgate in the shade, that the company paid a hauling contractor $60 a load to move crushed cane off the mill property. $60 a load, he said. Every load, all season long, just to make it somebody else's problem. Then he looked out toward the black mountain past the interior fence and said, "The only thing worse than being robbed was being used as a landfill and having it called neighborly." The neighbors were not much help. Half of them drew a paycheck from the refinery, and the other half did not want trouble with the people who signed those checks. When Verna brought it up at the feed store, a woman named Dorothy Halsey, who had known Amos since he was small enough to ride in a shopping cart, looked down at the concrete floor and said, "Honey, that's just how things are now." Pete Doheny, who farmed the place across the road, was standing at the register with a sack of mineral on his shoulder. He nodded once at what Dorothy said, the way a man nods at a weather forecast, and carried the sack out to his truck. That, more than the smell, more than the trucks, more than the yellow corn, was the moment Amos understood that nobody was coming. Not the courts, not the bank, not the company, not the neighbors. He was 16 the summer he stopped waiting for them. Yes. It began, the way most real things begin, with something small and easy to walk past. Late September, a warm afternoon of the kind that made the cicadas sound like a kettle nobody was ever going to take off the burner. Amos was working the interior fence with a roll of wire and a pair of fencing pliers, checking for the breaks that always showed up after a wet month. It was slow work and he liked it. Nobody talked to him while he did it, and it was one of the few jobs on the place where the results were visible by the end of the day. He came to the oldest part of the dumping ground around 4 o'clock. The trucks had abandoned that corner years ago in favor of fresher ground, and time had worked on it the way time works on everything. The pile had collapsed in on itself, flattened by 3 summers of rain, eaten down by weather until it was less a mountain than a long black bruise across the field. The field itself was dead. That was not an exaggeration, and Amos did not treat it as one. 6 years of raw, crushed cane had taken the shallow root zone out entirely, and what remained was gray-brown, cracked in the low spots, hard as fired clay in the high ones. Nothing grew there. Not pigweed, not Johnson grass, not the volunteer sunflowers that came up in every ditch in the parish whether anyone wanted them or not, which was why he stopped walking when he saw the green. It was on the south side of the collapsed pile, half tucked under a curl of decomposing cane fiber, and at first he took it for trash blown off a truck. Then he took 3 steps closer and stopped again. A tomato plant. A volunteer, seated by a bird or a boot or a passing wind, growing where nothing was supposed to grow. And it was not some sad, struggling thing hanging on by a thread. It was thick-stemmed and dark-leaved and nearly waist-high, and it had the look that healthy tomatoes get late in the season, a kind of arrogance, a plant that has stopped asking permission. It carried fruit in clusters heavy enough to bow the stems down into the fiber. 2 of the tomatoes had split from their own weight. One of them had a bird's beak mark in it and was still, somehow, better looking than anything in his mother's garden. Amos knew what his mother's garden looked like. He had helped build it, hauled water to it, weeded it on his knees in July. Verna Rowe grew tomatoes with real skill and real fertilizer bought in bags, and her plants that year had come in short and pale and slow, and she had blamed the weather because there was nothing else left to blame. He crouched down. The soil under the plant was not the gray deadpan of the rest of the field. It was dark. It was loose. He pushed 2 fingers into it and they went in easy up to the second knuckle. And when he pulled them out, they came up cool and smelled like nothing in particular, which was itself remarkable because everything on that end of the property smelled like molasses and rot. He sat back on his heels and looked at the plant for a long time. Long enough for the light to move and the shadow of the fence post to slide off his boot. A pickup went by out on the road and he did not turn his head. He had spent 6 years in a house where the Black Mountain was the reason for everything. It was the reason the corn failed, and the reason his mother stopped reading her mail at the table, and the reason his grandfather had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with his knees. Amos had learned to feel exactly one thing when he looked at that field, and he had gotten very good at feeling it. Helplessness has a shape, and after a while you can put your hand right on it in the dark. What he felt crouched in front of that tomato plant was not that. It took him most of the walk back to the house to name it, and when he did, it embarrassed him a little, because it seemed like too small a word for something that had knocked him that far off balance. He was curious. He picked 1 tomato before he left, the biggest one that had not split, and carried it back in his cap. That night he cut it up on the counter and ate it standing at the sink with salt, and he did not tell his mother where it came from. He was not being secretive exactly. He simply did not have a sentence yet that would survive being said out loud in that kitchen. There were 2 roads out of that field, and Amos understood both of them well enough by the time he reached the porch. The first road was the one his family had already spent 6 years on. It ran through the lawyer's office in the parish seat and the loan applications and the man in the tucked-in shirt and Hal Brennan's coffee cup. It required 11 signatures from relatives who did not answer the phone. It required $40,000, which was not a number the Rowes were ever going to have. And everyone involved in that road already knew it, which was precisely why the road existed in the shape it did. The second road did not go through anybody's office. It started with a question, and the question was very simple, and as far as Amos could tell, nobody in the whole parish had bothered to ask it. Why was that plant alive? He took the second road, and he took it quietly because he was 16 and had no evidence of anything, and knew exactly how the first conversation would go if he opened his mouth too early. The parish library was a low brick building next to the water tower with 2 computers and a window unit that rattled. The librarian there was a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Pendleton, and when Amos asked her the following Tuesday after school whether they had anything on composting, she did not ask him why. She walked him to a shelf and pulled 3 books, and by the end of the week she had found 4 more through the interlibrary system. After that, she started setting things aside without being asked. The Agricultural Extension Service up at the State University mailed technical bulletins to rural libraries by the crate, and most of them went straight into the recycling bin unread. Mrs. Pendleton began fishing them back out, flattening them and keeping them behind the desk in a manila folder with his name on it. He read at the kitchen table after his chores were done, most nights until 11, and what he learned came slowly and then all at once. The Black Mountain on the back 40 was not garbage. It was unfinished. Crushed cane fiber, the fibrous pulp left after the juice is pressed out, is one of the most carbon-rich agricultural residues on the planet. Dumped raw, in bulk, on open ground, it does exactly what Amos had watched it do for 6 years. It acidifies. It packs down and chokes drainage. It pulls the available nitrogen out of the top few inches of soil and locks it away inside its own decomposition, starving everything that tries to root there. That part he did not need a book for. He had lived on the downhill side of that chemistry since he was 10 years old. But the same material, under different conditions, becomes something else entirely. The book's called the finished product humus, and described it as dark and crumbling and sweet-smelling, a substance that feeds soil microbes, holds water, releases nutrients slowly, and builds earth the way coral builds a reef, one invisible layer at a time. Farmers had a plainer name for it. Living fertilizer, the kind that does not burn the ground out the way synthetic nitrogen does, but rebuilds it season by season. And compost, he read, is not made by people. It is made by life, by billions of bacteria and fungi and actinomycetes and protozoa, eating and breathing and dying and being eaten, in numbers no one has ever really counted. A working pile has a temperature and something close to a pulse, and when it is running properly, you can feel the heat of it against your palm from a foot away. Then he found the number, and the number was what did it. Carbon to nitrogen. Everything alive in a compost pile needs both, and the ratio between them decides whether the pile works or sits there for a decade doing nothing. The target, the books agreed, was somewhere around 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. 30 to 1. That was the working range where the biology caught fire. Crushed cane fiber, dumped raw, runs closer to 150 to 1. Amos sat at that table with a pencil in his hand and worked it out 3 times to be sure he had it right. The Black Mountain was not too poisonous to grow anything. It was too hungry. All that carbon, 6 years of it, 100,000 tons of the stuff, sitting out there in the dark starving for nitrogen and pulling it out of his family's dirt because nobody had given it any other option. It was not waste. It was raw material abandoned halfway through a process. And the process was not complicated, and it was not expensive, and it did not require anybody's permission. The company had not been dumping poison on his family's land. They had been dumping the front half of a recipe, paying $60 a load to do it, and they either did not know or did not care. He knew. And that, sitting there at 11 o'clock at night with a pencil and a stack of bulletins from a recycling bin, was the exact moment the story changed hands. He started in the first week of October, on a flat patch of ground behind the old equipment shed, chosen because it was the one place on the property you could not see from the road or from the kitchen window. He did not tell his mother. He was not sure yet that there was anything to tell, and he had a fairly clear idea of what she would say about a boy hauling refinery waste back onto the working side of the fence on purpose after what that waste had already cost them. She knew something was happening. A woman does not miss a wheelbarrow moving 4 times an afternoon, or a stack of library bulletins that grows an inch a week on the corner of her own kitchen table. She looked at both, more than once, and she decided not to ask, because she had learned somewhere along the way that asking a boy about the thing he has gone quiet over is usually how you make him quieter. The tomato plant was still standing out there in the dead field. He walked past it on his way to the dump site with an empty barrow, and he did not stop to look at it because he had stopped needing to. The first pile was 4 feet across and 3 feet high, and it took him 3 afternoons and most of a Saturday to build. The bulletins were specific about the order of things, and Amos followed them the way a person follows instructions in a language they are only beginning to read, which is to say exactly, and without improvising. He started with a base layer of coarse brush, dead branches he dragged out of the tree line behind the barn and laid crosswise on the bare ground. That was for air. A pile, sitting flat on packed dirt, suffocates from the bottom up, and the brush gave it a floor it could breathe through. Then the cane fiber. And the cane fiber was the part that cost him. The dump site was 600 feet from the equipment shed, across the dead field and through the gate in the interior fence, which he had to prop open with a cinder block because the latch had rusted shut years before anyone had a reason to use it. He worked the collapsed corner, the old one, because the weathered material broke apart easier and smelled less. One barrow held maybe 80 pounds when he packed it, and the ground between the gate and the shed was rutted and soft in the low spots. And by the fourth load, his forearms were shaking. He did 9 loads the first afternoon and finished at dark with about a third of what he needed. Chicken manure came from the coop, which was the one input on the whole operation that cost him nothing but the smell. He layered it thin, an inch at most, because the bulletins were emphatic that too much nitrogen all at once would turn the whole thing into a puddle of ammonia. Then a double handful of soil from the woods behind the barn, scraped up from under the leaf litter where it was black and full of thread-fine white fungal strands. That was the seed stock, the living part, the native microbes that would move into all that carbon and start the work. He did not entirely believe a handful of dirt could matter. He put it in anyway, then cane, then manure, then cane again. Water last, and water was where the bulletins got poetic in a way that turned out to be genuinely useful. The pile should feel like a wrung-out sponge, not wet, not damp, wrung out. He ran the hose in short bursts across each layer as he built, and when he was done, he pushed his hand into the side of it, took out a fist of fiber and squeezed. One drop ran down his wrist. He looked at it, decided that was what the sentence meant, and stopped watering. Then nothing happened. He came out every morning before school and put his palm flat against the side of the pile, and every morning it was cold. Cold and damp and inert. A heap of trash behind a shed, exactly what it looked like to anybody who might have walked up on it. On the 4th morning, he began composing, without meaning to, the argument he would make to himself later about why the experiment had been worth trying anyway. On the 6th morning, he checked the ratio math in his head while he did the milking, and could not find anything wrong with it, which was somehow worse. On the 9th morning, the pile was warm. Not warm like the sun had been on it. The sun had not been up long enough for that, and the warmth was in the wrong place, coming from the inside out. He kept his hand there a while and then went to school and thought about almost nothing else all day. On the 11th morning, it was hot. One of the bulletins described a way to measure the core without a thermometer, which he did not own. He found a length of steel rod in the equipment shed, 4 feet of it, rust on one end, and he drove it into the center of the pile at an angle and left it there while he fed the chickens. When he came back and pulled it out, the buried end was almost too hot to hold. He had to switch hands twice getting it clear. Amos stood there in the cold October morning with a steel rod in his fist, breath showing, and laughed out loud. It came out short and startled, and he had not meant to make the sound at all. There was nobody within 400 yards to hear it. It was alive. He had built a body, and it had started breathing, and the material it was breathing was the same material that had killed his family's bottomland, and nothing about that was a coincidence or a fluke. It was chemistry. It had a number attached to it, 30 to 1. But a working pile is not a finished pile, and he found that out 3 weeks later. The cold front came through in the 2nd week of November and dropped the temperature 30 degrees between supper time and the next morning. Louisiana does not get a great deal of hard freeze, but it gets enough, and it always arrives faster than anyone plans for. Amos went out at 6 with a flashlight and found the outer 8 inches of the pile stiff as a mattress. The core was still working, barely, but the frozen shell was pulling heat out of it faster than the biology could make it, and the whole thing had dropped into a kind of sullen half-speed that the bulletins described in one dry sentence about how thermophilic activity ceases below a certain threshold. Insulation was the answer, and insulation meant straw. There was straw in the barn, and using it was not stealing exactly, but it was not nothing either. He banked it 2 feet deep against the windward side. Then he went looking for a cover and found a canvas tarp folded on a shelf in the equipment shed, stiff with age, that had been sitting there unused since before his grandfather's knees gave out. Papa Isaiah did not know it was gone. Amos told himself he would put it back. Then came the turning, which is the part nobody mentions when they talk about compost, like it is a nice hobby for retired people. Every 5 days he had to take the pile apart with a pitchfork and put it back together inside out, moving the cool outer material into the hot core and the finished center out to the edges. It took 90 minutes if nothing went wrong. It involved lifting roughly 2,000 pounds of wet fiber, one forkful at a time, and then setting it down 18 inches away. His shoulders ached in a way that made it hard to sleep on either side. The skin over his knuckles split open in the cold and healed shut overnight and split again the next turning. And after the 3rd week, he stopped noticing the blood inside his gloves as anything other than a thing that happened on Sundays. Act 2. Part 2. Midpoint. The Central Conflict. 1,021 words. December brought 4 days of rain. It was not a storm. That was almost the worst of it. It was the flat, patient, grade Gulf rain that comes in off the water in winter and simply does not stop. An inch on Tuesday and an inch and a half on Wednesday and more on Thursday. The kind of weather where the sky never changes brightness from morning to dark. Amos had a tarp over the pile, and the tarp held, and he checked it twice a day and felt reasonably good about the whole thing. What he had not accounted for was the ground. Water does not only fall, it moves, and it moves downhill through soil, and the flat patch behind the equipment shed sat at the bottom of a very slight grade that ran off the barn lot. He had chosen the spot because you could not see it from the road. Nobody had ever asked him to think about where the runoff went. By Friday, the base of the pile was standing in it. The brush layer he had laid down for airflow was underwater, and water was wicking up into the fiber the way it wicks up into a towel with one corner in a sink. From the outside, the pile looked exactly the same. He put his hand on it Saturday morning and it was still warm, and he took that as good news and went to help his mother replace a section of gutter. He did not turn it until the following Wednesday. 6 days late because the ground had been too soft to work. The smell hit him on the second forkful. He had read about it. He knew the sentence by heart because it was in 3 of the 7 books, and he had copied it into the back of a school notebook. Finished compost smells sweet, like a forest floor after rain, while a pile gone wrong smells like a slaughterhouse. He had read that sentence in a warm kitchen and understood it as a comparison. It was not a comparison. It was a description. What came up out of the center of that pile put him back 3 full steps, with his sleeve across his face and his eyes watering. And it was not the sweet, fermented molasses stink of the dump site, which he had breathed every day since he was 10 and could tolerate the way you tolerate a neighbor's dog. This was different in kind. It was thick and sulfurous with something rotten and animal underneath it, and it came out of the pile in a visible curl of vapor, and it clung to his jacket so thoroughly that his mother made him leave the jacket on the porch that night without asking a single question about where he had been. He forked the rest of it open in a kind of numb, methodical fury and looked at what he had made. The material in the core was black, but it was the wrong black. Slick and matted, packed into dense, airless plates that came up on the fork in slabs. There were no white fungal threads. There was nothing that looked like the pictures. He understood what had happened before he finished the second row. The biology that made compost work was aerobic. Every one of those billions of organisms needed oxygen, and oxygen in a compost pile does not come from anywhere except the spaces between the particles. Fill those spaces with water, and you have not made a wet pile. You have made an entirely different environment, one that belongs to a completely different set of organisms, the anaerobic ones. And their metabolism produces hydrogen sulfide and methane and organic acids instead of humus. The bulletins had one clean, terrible phrase for the transition. The pile goes sour. He had drowned them. All of them. Everything he had built and fed and turned since the first week of October, everything that had made the steel rod too hot to hold, was dead in there. And it had not been killed by the refinery, or by Hal Brennan, or by 11 relatives who would not sign a piece of paper. It had been killed by a boy who had not thought about which way the water ran. Amos sat down on the upturned wheelbarrow in the cold and stayed there a while, and the thing that went through him was not exactly despair. It was a reorganization. He had spent 6 years believing that the enemy was a company. That was the story the whole parish told, and it was true as far as it went, and it had one enormous convenience built into it. If the enemy was a company, then nothing that happened was his fault, and nothing that happened was in his hands. That story had a shape you could lean against. The pile did not care about any of that. The pile did not know about the refinery. It had no opinion about the deed in the tin box, or the letters with no reason on them. It had needs, and the needs were specific and non-negotiable, and it had told him exactly what it needed by getting hot when he got it right and dying when he got it wrong. His grandfather had said the same thing in a different language, sitting on that tailgate, and Amos had heard it as sentiment. The land does not lie. A compost pile is not a container. He had copied that line down in October and thought it was a nice way of putting things. It was not a nice way of putting things. It was a body. It had a temperature and a pulse, and it could suffocate, and he had let it. And the difference between the boy who copied that sentence and the boy sitting on the wheelbarrow was that one of them had killed something and knew precisely how. He got up before dark and started digging a drainage trench along the upper edge of the flat spot, uphill, cutting across the grade. It took him 2 evenings. Then he built the second pile 18 inches up on a bed of gravel salvaged from the old driveway, and after that he did not build another one on flat ground for as long as he worked that land. The rebuilding went faster than the first time because he was no longer following instructions. He was troubleshooting, which is a different activity entirely. By late January, he had 2 piles running on gravel beds behind the equipment shed, and a third one started. He had worked out that the aged material from the collapsed corner broke down nearly twice as fast as the fresh fiber the trucks were still delivering, because 3 years of weather had already done the first part of the job for free. He had learned to read a pile by the color of the steam coming off it on a cold morning, and to tell by the weight on the fork whether it wanted water or air. None of that was in the bulletins. All of it came from having been wrong once in a way he could smell from 20 feet. What he had not solved was the wheelbarrow. There was no way around it. The material was 600 feet from where it needed to be. He had no tractor he was allowed to run for something he had not explained to anybody, and so the only machine involved in the entire operation was a 16-year-old boy with a steel frame barrow crossing an open field 40 or 50 times a week. On a Saturday morning in the last week of January, a boy from his class named Dale Whitcomb drove past the row place on his way to somewhere else and saw exactly that. Amos was crossing the barn lot with a full load of chicken manure, which is not a subtle cargo. He had a shovel laid across the top of it. He was wearing a jacket that had been washed twice and still carried December in the seams. He looked up when the truck slowed, and Dale looked at him for about 4 seconds through the window, and then the truck went on. By Monday afternoon, the entire school had it. They called him the Manure Boy. That was the whole joke, and it did not need any embellishment, and it went around the way things go around in a school of 400 students where nothing has happened since the last thing. Somebody wrote it on his locker in black marker on the second day in letters 4 inches high. Amos looked at it for a while that morning before first period. Then he went to class. He did not wipe it off. He thought about it during algebra and decided that wiping it off was a conversation, and that he was not interested in having the conversation, and that anything he did to that locker other than open it would be reported around the building by lunch as evidence that it had landed. So he left it there. It stayed for 11 days before a custodian took it off with a solvent rag, and Amos never touched it once. But it landed. It would be a lie to say otherwise, and it landed harder than it would have landed on Dale Whitcomb, because Amos understood something about that particular joke that his classmates were not thinking about carefully enough to be cruel about on purpose. He was a black kid in a cane parish, whose family had held 80 acres for 4 generations, and had spent every one of those generations being told, in 100 polite and impolite ways, exactly which kind of work was theirs. His great-grandfather had bought that ground in 1901 specifically so that no Roe would ever again be the man other people pointed at with a shovel in his hands. And now here he was, on purpose, hauling waste that a company had dumped on his family's land, and the whole school had a name for him. His mother found out in the second week, and it came apart at the kitchen table on a Thursday night. Verna Rowe had spent 6 years on the paperwork. She had sat in the lawyer's office and read both of those letters and driven out to see Hal Brennan 3 times. And she had done all of it with one particular idea holding her upright: that her son was going to finish school and go somewhere and do work that did not require a shovel. She said the words soil biology back to him that night in a tone that made them sound like a hobby he had picked up to avoid his future. She asked whether he understood what people were going to say about him. She asked whether he had any idea what she had been trying to keep him out of. She was not wrong. That was the thing that made it unbearable. Every fear she put on that table was a real fear with a real history behind it, and she had earned all of them personally. And there was no version of the argument where Amos got to tell her she was being unreasonable. He told her he was not going to stop. She told him to wash the jacket. Neither of them said anything else about it for 2 months. Nathaniel Halloran turned up in the middle of that stretch in early February, and he turned up sideways. Halloran was 74 and had been the parish extension agent for 23 years before he retired, and he still came into the high school 2 days a week to help with the agriculture program because nobody had ever formally told him to stop. He had grown up on a dairy 2 parishes over and taken his degree in agronomy at Southern University, and he had spent most of his working life driving out to farms where the men who called him for advice were sometimes surprised, on arrival, about who the extension agent turned out to be. He noticed Amos reading a soil biology textbook at a table by himself during lunch, and he did not say anything about it that day. The next day he came through, set a battered paperback down on the table, and kept walking. The cover was held on with packing tape. It was An Agricultural Testament by Sir Albert Howard, published in 1940, the book from which essentially all of modern organic composting descends. Halloran got about 6 steps past the table before he turned around. "Read it when you can," he said, and then, after long enough that Amos had gone back to his sandwich, "If you need help, my barn's got space." Amos read it twice. He did not go to the barn. He was not being proud about it. He had simply decided, somewhere around December, that he was going to be able to say the thing was his before he let anybody help him carry it. He was turning 3 piles every Sunday afternoon by then, alone, while the rest of the parish was in church. By the first week of April, he had it. He knew he had it, in the way you know a thing you have measured yourself and cannot prove to anyone else. The oldest pile had gone through its full cycle. It had run hot for 6 weeks, cooled slowly through February, and by the end of March it had stopped generating heat altogether, which is not failure but the opposite. It had finished. He turned it one last time and stood looking at material he genuinely did not recognize. It was deep brown going to black. It crumbled between his fingers into loose, granular crumb, like coffee grounds, like the floor of a hardwood bottom. There was no fiber left in it that you could identify as cane. Earthworms had found it, which was its own kind of report card, because earthworms will not enter a pile that is still acidic. When he put his face down close and breathed in, it did not smell like molasses or manure or anything from the refinery. It smelled like dirt. Good dirt. The honest, ancient smell of the good bottom, the way his grandfather described it, and the way Amos had never once smelled it himself, because by the time he was old enough to notice, the trucks had already been coming for 3 years. He had made about 2.5 cubic yards of it, and he had, in the way that mattered to anybody else in the world, nothing at all. No laboratory, no soil test, because a full panel ran $55 a sample and he had $11. No bank, since the letters in the tin box had settled that question twice without explanation. No lawyer, no 11 signatures, no $40,000. No allies except a librarian who saved him bulletins and a retired extension agent whose barn he had never gone to. A mother who had not mentioned the subject in 2 months and would not meet his eye about it. A nickname that had followed him out of February, and 6 months of labor, roughly 400 hours of it by his own rough count, poured into a heat behind a shed that the entire parish would have described in 3 words if anybody had asked. Then the letter came, and the letter set the clock running. It arrived on a Tuesday in a windowed envelope with the Callaway Sugar Refining Company return address, and Verna read it standing at the counter and then set it down on the table where Amos could reach it. It was 1 page. It was courteous. It advised the property owners of record that the company would be expanding its material staging area in advance of the coming grinding season, and it included a survey diagram with a dashed line on it. Amos looked at the dashed line for a long time before he understood what he was looking at. The expansion ran west across the back 40 and then turned. It took in the collapsed old corner, which he did not much care about, because he had nearly worked that section out anyway. And then it crossed the interior fence and covered the quarter-acre patch of sandy, tired ground on the near side of the house. The one that had grown nothing but pigweed for 2 seasons. The one he had walked past every day since January while working out in his head how he would break it and where he would run the rows. That was the plot. That was the only ground on the place he could plant without asking anybody's permission or risking anything anybody else needed. And it was scheduled to be under crushed cane by September. He could wait a year and be certain, or he could put everything he had made onto that ground now in April with no test data and no second finished batch and no way to build one before the trucks came. Amos went out to the shed that evening and filled a coffee can with the finished material and carried it into the kitchen and set it on the table, in front of his mother and his grandfather, in the middle of supper. "Fertilizer," he said, "from the back lot." Nobody said anything at first. Verna looked at the can and then at him, and the 2 months of not talking about it sat right there on the table with the can. Papa Isaiah reached over. He was 79 and his hands were not good anymore, but he got 2 fingers into the can and brought up a small amount and held it up under the ceiling light. Then he rubbed it slowly between his thumb and forefinger and let it fall back. And the crumb broke apart in the air the way finished compost does, in loose grains rather than clods. He did not say anything at all. He did not need to. Something moved across the old man's face that Amos had not seen there in 6 years, and it was not surprise, and it was not pride exactly. It was recognition. He had held that in his hand before, a long time ago, and he had not expected to do it again. Verna picked the can up last. She smelled it, which surprised her son, and then she set it down and looked out the window toward the interior fence for a while. And what she finally said was not about the compost. "How much of it is there?" 2 yards, a little more. "Then it had better be enough," she said, and got up to clear the plates. He spread it over the quarter-acre across the following 4 days, by hand and by hoe, because there was no equipment small enough to do it right, and no time to argue for the equipment there was. 2.5 cubic yards over 10,000 square feet is a thin dressing, thinner than any bulletin recommended, and he worked it into the top 4 inches and watered it in, and knew the whole time that he was doing the one thing every book warned against, which was betting the entire demonstration on a single application on the worst ground available. He planted sweet corn and pole beans and 3 kinds of tomatoes in the 2nd week of April. Then there was nothing left to do but chores and school and the piles and waiting, which was the part he was worst at. Because if that quarter-acre came up short and yellow like everything else on that end of the parish, he would not merely have wasted 6 months and 400 hours. He would have proved, with his own hands and in plain view of the road, the exact thing Dorothy Halsey had said on the concrete floor of the feed store. "That's just how things are now." There was nothing left he could do for that quarter-acre. He had made his one bet and put it in the ground, and from the second week of April onward, the verdict belonged to the weather and the biology and the soil, none of which take requests. So he did his chores. He turned his piles. He watched and tried not to watch too obviously, because his mother could read him from the kitchen window. May was ordinary, which was neither good news nor bad. Corn comes up even in poor ground and then quits in June, and Amos knew that, so he refused to take any comfort from a straight green stand. The beans broke the surface. The tomato transplants sulked for 10 days the way transplants always do. He walked the rows after supper with his hands in his pockets and made himself stop counting things. Then the first week of June came, and the quarter-acre stopped looking like the rest of the farm. It looked like a photograph from his grandfather's time. The corn stood waist-high by the 6th of June, and it was the wrong color for that end of the parish entirely. A deep blue-green instead of the thin yellow-green everything else wore, with leaves held wide and upright rather than curled in on themselves against the heat. The tomatoes had gone dark-leaved and heavy, exactly the way the volunteer plant in the dead field had been dark and heavy. And Amos understood for the first time that he had not been looking at a miracle out there in September. He had been looking at an experiment somebody else had already run for him, by accident, with a bird and a rotted-down corner of a dump. The bean trellis had to be restaked twice, once in June and again in the second week of July, because the vines kept climbing past the top of it and folding over into the row. None of it made sense unless you knew what had gone into the ground, and that was the part Amos found himself thinking about at night. It was the same seed he had planted in his mother's garden. The same rain fell on both. That quarter-acre had been the worst dirt on 80 acres, sandy and worn out and grown over with pigweed for 2 seasons, and it was now outproducing ground his family had been babying with bagged fertilizer for years. The only variable was 2.5 cubic yards of material the refinery had spent 6 years paying to get rid of. Pete Doheny farmed the place directly across the road, and he was the same man who had nodded along at the feed store register while Dorothy Halsey explained how things were now. On a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of July, he pulled onto the shoulder, got out and leaned on the fence, and he watched Amos pick beans for close to 20 minutes without saying one word. Amos knew he was there the whole time and kept picking. "What are you putting on it?" Doheny finally asked. Amos straightened up with the bucket against his hip. He thought about 6 years of nobody asking that question. Or any question. "Fertilizer I made," he said, "out of the cane waste." Doheny wanted to know from where. Amos lifted his chin toward the black mountain past the interior fence, and the older man looked at it a while, then took off his cap, ran a hand back through his hair, put the cap on again, and walked across the road to his own truck, without saying anything else. The survey crew came in the 3rd week of August, 2 men in a white pickup with a bundle of wooden stakes and a roll of orange flagging. They worked their way along the fence and then turned up across the near side of the property exactly the way the dashed line had said they would. They drove 3 stakes into the edge of the quarter-acre, 20 feet in from the corn, and left. Amos went out that evening and stood next to the closest one. The corn beside it was over his head by then and had tasseled out, and the ears were filling, and the whole plot was in full production with beans coming in faster than his mother could put them up. He did not pull the stake. He looked at it the way he had looked at the writing on his locker in February and made the same decision. That a stake in the ground is a conversation, and he was going to let somebody else start it. The crew did not come back. The grinding season ran nearly 2 months late that year because the rain had held the harvest off the fields, and the expansion sat where all expansions sit when the calendar moves, which is on a desk. The stakes stayed up through September with the flagging going pale in the sun, and every time Amos walked the rows, he walked past them. Nathaniel Halloran came out on the 2nd Saturday of September with a soil test kit from the school's agriculture program and a metal probe, and he pulled samples from 3 places: the quarter-acre, the good bottom, and the original dumping ground itself. He offered no opinions in the yard. He said he would run the numbers and drove home. He came back the following weekend and sat at the kitchen table for close to 2 hours with Verna and Papa Isaiah. The quarter-acre carried nearly 3 times the organic matter of the surrounding fields. The biological activity in it was the highest reading he had recorded anywhere in 23 years of doing that job across that parish. What the boy had built behind the equipment shed, Halloran told them, was not a soil amendment or a mulch or a homemade trick. It was a complete organic fertilizer. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace minerals, and live biology. All of it in balance. And every bit of it pulled out of material the company across the fence was currently paying money to throw away. He was looking directly at Amos when he said it. He did not look away afterward. The company came in October, not Hal Brennan, a younger man, better suit, quieter voice, and he stood in the yard with a clipboard held against his chest and asked, very carefully, whether the Rowe family would be open to a conversation about the material on the back lot. Amos was the one who answered the door. He had rehearsed for that moment. In December, sitting on the wheelbarrow next to a drowned pile, and in February with 4-inch letters on his locker, he had built entire speeches for the day somebody from Callaway came back up that gravel drive. Standing there with his hand on the screen door, he found he could remember all of them, and that every one had gone small on him. They were the speeches of a person who needed something from the man on the porch. "You can talk to my grandfather," he said. "He's in the barn." What followed took 2 years, and it was not a courtroom victory. Nobody collapsed. Hal Brennan kept his job and retired out of it 4 years later with a party in the break room. There was no public reckoning, and Amos came to understand, slowly, that he had never actually wanted one. Halloran was the one who kept him from making the obvious mistake. The company's first offer was a consulting arrangement, a modest monthly figure for the boy's time and his method, which was flattering enough that Amos read it twice. The old extension agent read it once, set it down on the kitchen table, and asked him a question instead of giving him advice. Did he want to be paid for knowing how? Or did he want to own the thing that knowing how produced? A man who sells his labor, Halloran said, sells it once a month for as long as somebody wants it. A man who sells a product sells it every season, to everyone, and nobody gets to decide he is finished. So Amos did not take the consulting money. What he negotiated instead, in the first year, was a supply agreement, and he negotiated it with his mother in the room because he was 17 and could not sign it himself. The terms looked generous from the company's side of the table and were the entire game from his. Callaway would deliver crushed cane fiber to the Rowe property line at their own expense, at no charge for the material, for as long as the mill operated, which cost them less than hauling it anywhere else, a point Amos made once and then let sit. In exchange, and because their own attorneys had begun to have thoughts about 6 years of undocumented dumping on Heir's property, the company would clear the old site at its own expense and restore the grade. He asked for one more thing, and it was the clause nobody at the table understood but him. 300 cubic yards of the aged material from the collapsed corner, the stuff 3 years of weather had already half broken down, was to be moved and stockpiled behind the equipment shed rather than hauled off with the rest. That was his starter. Every new windrow he built for the next 4 years got a few forkfuls of it, the way a baker keeps a piece of yesterday's dough. The Black Mountain came off that field in 11 weeks. It did not come off because anyone was forced. It came off because the value had moved, the way men like that always understand things. The second year was arithmetic. The refinery had been paying to get rid of carbon. It turned out 3 poultry operations within 20 miles were paying to get rid of nitrogen, and none of them had ever thought of themselves as being in the same business. Amos built windrows 140 feet long behind the equipment shed, on gravel, with drainage cut across the grade, and he sold in bulk by the pickup load to farmers in the parish. Pete Doheny was the first. 6 more followed him inside 4 months, most of them men who had never once spoken to a Rowe about soil. The third year was paperwork, and the paperwork was harder than the compost had ever been. Organic certification for a fertilizer input meant documented inputs, batch records, temperature logs, contamination testing, and a review process that took 9 months and rejected his first submission over a record-keeping format. He had drowned a pile in December once and learned more in an afternoon than in 6 weeks of reading. The certification taught him nothing except patience, which he already had, and how to keep a file, which he did not. But it changed the number. Loose compost sold by the truckload competes with dirt. The same material, certified, screened, and closed up in 40-pound bags, sells to garden centers and nursery suppliers and regional farm stores at several times the price. And the bags do not care whose land they came from. By the 6th year, there were 4 people on the payroll, and 3 of them had worked at the refinery. A graduate student from the state university came down and spent a summer measuring his windrows and left with data for a thesis that named him in the acknowledgments. A regional farming magazine ran a piece on the operation, 1,100 words and 2 photographs. Verna framed it and hung it above the kitchen sink, and it stayed there. Amos was 24 the spring the accountant's summary showed cumulative revenue past $1 million. He looked at the figure for a moment, then he set the page down on the desk, because the thing he actually wanted was still out there in the low corner of the property. And it was not done. We had started on the good bottom in the 2nd year, the spring after the truck stopped, when he was 18 and the field was still flat and gray and sour from 100,000 tons of raw cane. It took 4 more years of real work before it would grow anything worth counting. He worked it the way his grandfather would have, which meant slowly, and by hand where hands were better, and with no interest at all in doing it fast. Cover crops first, 2 seasons of them, turned in green. Then compost, heavy, more than he sold to any customer, worked in and left alone. The pH came up 1/10 of a point at a time. Earthworms arrived in the 3rd year, and he found the first one on a warm April morning and carried it 100 feet to show his mother, who was less impressed than he was, though not by much. Papa Isaiah was 87 the summer the first corn came out of that ground. He did not walk the whole fence line anymore. He went as far as the low corner with a cane and a good deal of patience. And that particular morning, he stopped and stood with one hand on the top wire, looking at a stand of sweet corn that had come in waist-high by July, on the same dirt he had bragged about to a 10-year-old boy in a different life. He got himself down far enough to take up a handful of it, which took a while, and he held it near his face and breathed in. Nothing. No molasses, no rot. Just the flat, cool, mineral smell of a river bottom in summer, the smell that had been missing out of that corner of the world for 11 years. He put it back where he found it and did not say much about it. He never had. He did not see the second crop. By the time Amos was 27, the soil in that field ran darker and deeper than anything within 50 miles, and the 80 acres still carried the family's name on the paper in the tin box. That was the only figure he ever really counted. People ask him sometimes what the lesson was. He does not have a clean answer, and he is not the sort of man who trusts clean answers. But on quiet evenings, when the light is going down behind the barn and the swallows are cutting low across the pasture, he has been known to say something close to this. The land does not lie. Patience is not the same thing as waiting. The people who shout the loudest are almost never the ones who change anything. And whatever gets called waste is usually only waste because nobody has bothered to understand it yet. There is a card pinned to the inside wall of the equipment shed. The handwriting on it faded now to a soft pencil gray. Halloran gave it to him the week the certification came through, and Halloran had been given it by one of his own teachers, 40-odd years before that, in a classroom at Southern University. It is a line from George Washington Carver, the agricultural scientist who built an entire career on the conviction that humble things hold extraordinary possibilities. Anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. The cane waste did. It gave up everything it had, its carbon and its nitrogen, and all that silent biology waiting inside it for somebody to bring it the one thing it was missing, and it became the richest fertilizer in the parish. The land gave up its secrets too, slowly, over 11 years, on the condition that somebody came out and asked properly. So did the boy. Though he would never put it that way about himself. He just kept turning the pile every Sunday afternoon, alone, in the quiet, while the rest of the parish was in church. He turned it when it was a joke on a locker door, and he turned it when it was a business with 4 employees, and the motion never changed at all. Lift, move, set down, 18 inches over, until the world eventually came all the way around to where he had been standing the entire time. There is one part of this story that is easy to miss, and it is not the money. Nobody rescued Amos Rowe. No court ruled in his favor, no reporter took up his cause, no stranger wrote a check. Every door built for people in his situation had already been closed and locked, twice, on paper, without a reason given. What changed his family's life was not justice arriving. It was a 16-year-old asking one question nobody else in the parish thought was worth asking. Why is that plant alive? That question cost nothing. It required no permission, no lawyer, no $40,000. It required only that he keep looking at the thing everyone else had already decided they understood. And here is the harder half of it. He earned the right to that answer by killing a compost pile in December through his own carelessness, and by sitting on an overturned wheelbarrow long enough to understand it was his fault, and by going out before dark to dig a trench instead of a story about who was to blame. The refinery took 6 years from his family. The pile took 1 afternoon. He learned more from the pile. So, a question for you, and answer it however honestly you like in the comments. What is sitting in your life right now that you have already labeled a loss, a dead end, or somebody else's fault? And how long has it been since you actually looked at it? Somebody watching this has a version of that black mountain out behind their own house. If that is you, we would like to hear about it. Subscribe if you want more stories about quiet people who were underestimated for a long time and turned out to be right. And go easy on yourself this week. Some things take 11 years.